here actually to listen to John Frearson talk tonight about James Speight of Sutton Coldfield and his family of photographers. Now, John is a retired construction materials consultant, but in his retirement, he's become a family, a company and local historian, researcher, lecturer and author of several books. He's been giving talks on local history now for about 10 years. He lives in Rugby, and one of his specialisms is the Speight family of photographers who, as we'll hear, have a branch in Rugby. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to John. I'm going to turn my video off so you won't see me. You'll just see James's slides. Sorry, John's slides. John's slides of James's photos. Brilliant. Okay, that's enough from me. I can hear you all giving John a very warm round of applause and welcoming this evening. Thank you, John. Over to you.
Right. Good evening, everybody. Nice to be with you. As you've heard, this is the first of two parts, so hopefully you'll be enthused enough with the first part to come back to the second part, which has far more of Sutton Coldfield in it. However, James Speight, who I'm sure a lot of you will know about, having been in, as he was in Sutton for about 50 years as a photographer. So we'll first deal with his family, which are fascinating. And just a way of very quick introduction, I came across the Speight family when I helped clear a house down in Bedfordshire. And the family who had lived there had previously lived up in Leicestershire, near Market Harborough, and they had a lot of family photos by some chap called Gulliver Speight, who we'll hear about in a minute. It sparked my interest because I was just trying to date the photos. So I looked him up and found he was born in Rugby, which is where I'm speaking from. Having thought that would make 10 minutes for a local history sort of contribution, I found there was more and more and more, and now even talking about one of them can take 2 talks. So that's me. We're going to move to look at James Speight particularly this evening, but we'll also look at his brothers and his family. And these are his grandparents, James and Mary née Hall Speight. That was taken before 1876 when James Sr. died. So it was quite nice to find those very early photographs when I was searching through the family's archive. Well, those two, James and Mary, ran away to Gretna Green to get married, which was perhaps rather unusual and gives a bit of interest. However, Mary was not quite happy whether this was quite right, so in fact they got married again in a proper church. Well, this is James Speight's father, the son of James and Mary. Edward Hall Speight, born in the Lake District, was a school teacher, and he was appointed head of the Wesleyan School in Rugby in 1861. Hence my interest. Oh, somebody from Rugby. Oh, that's interesting. Took up photography as a hobby, left teaching to set up a photography business in 1871. Basically, he was having to take so many photos for his friends that he had to start charging them. And having started charging them, he found he was still getting people coming to have photographs taken. It was a new popular thing to have done, and he found he was earning more from photography than teaching. So he became a full-time photographer in about 1871. Couple more pictures of him. I'm very envious of his beard, but it hasn't gone quite as grey as mine. And we see him on the right with his pocket camera, or the camera he took out with him. And of course, it's not quite the same as doing it with your phone as you might well do these days. The interesting thing here as well as this self-portrait, which was probably taken by one of his sons, in the studio with a fancy studio background. So we're always looking at backgrounds to try and date these things. But this is a cabinet print, which is a larger print, a bit bigger than a postcard. And it's got his name, it's got Rugby on it. It helps us date the photographs because of the different mounts that they're on, and sometimes with the writing on the back. So the large one is a cabinet. The smaller one, which is about the size of a playing card, is called a CDV, a carte de visite. You'll probably mostly know that, but just in case, I was reminded I needed to tell you. And in fact, if you're looking at an ordinary computer screen, the cabinet print is probably similar size to Edward and his camera, and the CDV would be just a bit smaller than the one on the left. Right. Well, he first worked from 16 Lawford Road in Rugby, used an old railway coach as a studio, and this CDV is one of the very few showing this early address. I think I've got about 4 in the collection. There are obviously people have got others, but it helps us date things because he was at 16 Lawford Road for a fairly short time. The first record we have of him taking photographs is in 1874. He was taking children and teachers in 6 groups, and it's recorded in the school logbook for Elborough School. By 1875, he was advertising in the Nuneaton Advertiser. The Nuneaton Advertiser, because the Rugby Advertiser hadn't started at that time, and the Nuneaton Advertiser was the one to advertise in. Not a very clear copy, I'm afraid, but you can see the little carte de visite, 1 copy a shilling, half a dozen copies, 3 shillings, a dozen copies, and I think it's probably 5 shillings. He started going out to other towns to photograph. Partly he was sussing them out for his children, who we'll come to later. But in 1879, he went to Nuneaton, and as you can see, he took pictures and then said you could come and buy them from him a little bit later. One of his sitters was Rupert Brooke. This was in 1903. Again, we've got a different mount here, a later mount, helps us date it. Rupert Brooke was at Rugby School, and Edward Hall Speight did a lot of the photography at Rugby School. Rupert Brooke gave out signed photographs of himself at public school. I would be delighted if any of you would find another one, because they are worth quite a lot of money. This is the Speight home and studio at Dunchurch Road. He moved from the earlier Lawford Road to this house in Dunchurch Road, number 35. It was later renumbered by the post office as number 16, so a lot of people assumed he'd changed studios again. He had a shop in the front of the house, and if you went through or down the side passage, his studio was actually in a shed at the back, which had been a former woodworking shop for the previous occupants. But as you can see, quite a nice place, quite well set up, big notice, Speight, windows set out, and a nice property. They could afford quite a nice house. and some later CDVs showing how we can see the different dating. We've got under the patronage of the Queen, that being Victoria, of course. I won't go into the detail of how they got the patronage, but he did. He provided a photograph for the Queen. And then under the patronage of the late Queen, obviously tells us we've got later pictures. He produced a couple of books of photographs with about 8 photos, mainly of churches in this particular one. And then he had a family tucked away in that house. The 1881 census shows 7 children. So we've got Edward, his wife Louisa, Lizzie and Gulliver, who were both photographers, Edward, who was also a photographer. So we've got 4 photographers in the house and 4 more boys who were too young to have a job or to be put in as having a job. So we're going to quickly look at the children. This is Lizzie in the center, his eldest child and daughter. I would love to have this in color. I'd also love to have the names of the other girls there, but I'm sure these weren't as black and white as they look. I'm sure these were quite interesting colors, albeit fairly dark colors, but this would have been taken by E.H. Speight himself. Here's Lizzie a bit later on, just before she got married. And this is a hand-colored version, which was hand-colored by James. So important to put that in because James had some artistic talent, as you can see, in order to be able to color this black and white photo, print it less heavily, and just color it with watercolors or whatever paints he was using. This was in her grandson's house down in Southampton when I went to visit them doing some research. Lizzie again, now getting a bit older, and the photos taken by James Walker, another photographer who became her husband. And they were working, he was working in Birmingham and she was living in Birmingham at that time. Interestingly, the same James Walker, photographer and chemist, took a photograph of Cecilia Gertrude Hill here on the left. 20 years later, she became James Speight's wife. So a little bit of history there. Well, they had 6 sons. It is said the sons were sent into the world with £5, a Bible, and a tin trunk to put their things in. And their names: Gulliver Hall, Edward Atkinson, George William Clare. As he always used the name Clare, we have people who think that he had a daughter who was a photographer, but that is definitely a bloke. Charles Isles, a family name there, Harry Harrison, and James, who seems only they've run out of names and only had one. But anyhow, there is a family album which we have managed to locate, re-find, and a copy of that, and that gives lots of photos of them. I won't show them all, we'd be here all night, but it helps show us what props were in fashion and helps dating other portraits. The sons all went on to be, as I said, photographers. Gulliver went to Market Harborough finally. Edward was in Poole for a while, then Exmouth and Rochdale, Clare in Nuneaton and Rugby, Charles in Kettering, Harry, Leamington Spa, Redditch and Rugby, and James was in Lichfield, King's Lynn, Paris, and finally finished in Sutton Coldfield, which is why you've got me here tonight. Well, they took photos of the family. Didn't necessarily name everybody, but after you've been looking at them long enough, you know them all by sight at whatever age they are. So this was Christmas 1900. The various members of the family. James Walker here, if you can see my arrow going round is Lizzie's, the eldest daughter's husband, and there's two of their children, Henry and Dora Walker. Where, you might ask, is James? We know he was there with the family that Christmas because his diary, and he kept a diary, and we've got copies of it. Well, we have the originals in the record office now. James was there. So I can only assume that James, as the youngest, had the job of taking the family photograph. Somebody else will do it next year, perhaps. Well, we'll look at the boys quickly. Don't want to spend too much time. This is Gulliver, the eldest, and one of his pictures, one of his self-portraits on the right. He was quite a good bassoon and clarinetist and played in orchestras in Market Harborough, where he worked. He was a sportsman. He's in the center here, holding the ball, must have been the captain. And in fact, the chap in front is his assistant. If you want a job with me doing photographs, you've got to come and play the footy on the afternoons. Charles Mumford would also set up a studio in Market Harborough in competition. Gulliver first had a small shop and then moved into the square. And as you can see, quite a fine house, nice windows. And he built a studio, again, a two-story brick building behind in the garden, behind the house. The front of the house is now in Leicester Museum as part of their Victorian street. Unfortunately, the rest was knocked down because it was the way through to a memorial rose garden after the First World War. And one of the last photos we have of Gulliver was when he was 85, still working, photographed for the Picture Post magazine, taken just after the Second World War. So he was still very active. And as you can see, quite a large camera on a stand. The stand is still in the Speight family. We borrowed it for an exhibition at Market Harborough a few years ago. Gulliver was also a prize-winning rose grower. Fortunately, some of the medals have been preserved. Most of his rosettes were buried with him, which is rather a pity, but at least we've got some quite interesting medals. Saltaire and Shipley's District Rose Society. So he would go on a train and go off and display his roses. Right, enough of him. Second son was Edward. Edward was a less successful photographer. He was a very good photographer. We've got a few photos here at various ages. Again, he had a CDV and a cabinet mount with his name and where he was, Imperial Road, Exmouth. And some of these CDVs, we even have one with the tissue cover that came over the photograph to preserve it. A couple of his cabinet prints. The one of the soldier, I think, is superb, but they were all good quality. But as you can see, the mounts are different. So we can date even in the short time he was in Exmouth. We have this rather good photo that was loose in an album. We didn't quite know who they all were until we found another loose piece that had been cut out because it had something on the other side. Well, it's obviously the same sofa. Fortunately, it says Exmouth, June 99. So we know that is Mrs. Edward Speight, the 4 children, the new baby, and Edward Hall Speight's wife. Research can lead you in interesting ways. Well, in 1900, James Speight's diary says, I had a letter from home in which they told me Ted was at home, he sold his business and going into a situation. And then in October, Ted arrived from Birmingham. He'd been there after a situation, but it was no good. He was very cheerful under all his difficulties, very impulsive and lacking in experience. This is the 21-year-old James, the youngest son, commenting on his brother, who is about 15 years older than him, which is a bit of a cheek, but there we are. He's not knocked out about enough. Coming home and seeing other ways of working will do him good. He knows this too. Charlie took his photograph in the afternoon. We don't have that photograph, but it must be somewhere. His business in Exmouth was taken over by E.G. Margery, and he just overstamped the Speight mounts. Don't waste the mounts. Edward moved to Oldham, as his grandson said, God knows why. What on earth did he want to go to Oldham for? He did a bit of photography, he did photographic work for other people, and he did a few postcards. So we've got 1 or 2 postcards stamped E.A. Speight, Gainsborough Avenue, Oldham. The third son was Clare, George William Clare, but always known as Clare. This was taken in about 1876 and gives you an idea of how complex some of the studio settings could be in his father's studio. We've got a very fine rock, which appears in quite a few seaside pictures. And we have this wonderful boat with Clare sitting in it. It's presumably a backcloth with a cut in it, so you can sit inside. And you've got a rather incorrect bow wave, because obviously I don't think it's going along at great speed, but it's an interesting backcloth, and we've got one of the other children in it as well. Clare was in Nuneaton, and again, quite a fancy mount. This was his studio in Coton Road after 1897 when he built it. Another fine building. I mean, he had this built for him. There must have been money in photography, because he had built this. He had this fine Golgan's head carving, copied from an old Exeter letterbox. And that was in an article in Practical Photographer, the information in 1898. So they're well enough known to be featured. This is his studio, and it tells us a little bit about studios of this time. You've got a shop at the front, stairs going upstairs, and behind the shop you've got the workroom, a sink, a dark room with a sink, heating, toilet facilities out the back. We can see all the pipes and drains and everything, so it's quite a good planning application drawing. Upstairs, if you went up the stairs, you got into the studio, which also included a dressing room. You might take your own clothes to change there into what you want to be photographed in, or in some cases, the photographer would have costumes and would provide them for his sitters. Whether he hired them out, I'm sure they charged something for them, but there we are. But lovely to see this planning application, which is in the Warwick County Record Office. Clare used to get off and around Europe. He could afford to take European holidays. This is a splendid humorous card he sent back in May 1899, signed Clare. It really is a superb drawing. You don't think of Victorians having humorous seaside postcards. Well, it's not seaside, but you know what I mean. The album of the Speight postcards was also saved. We managed to say, yes, I'll look after it. And we've got it into the Warwick Record Office, so it's there available, plus lots of other photos and postcards. In the 1901 census, we find Claire Speight at Chilvers Coton, a boarder, age 31. We actually also find him in Rugby, age 32. So he's obviously aged overnight or during the night. And if you're looking at the population of the country, remember to knock at least one off for Claire, who's been counted twice. Again, money no object. He had a motor tricycle. James Speight wrote in his diary, Claire's just come over on his new motor tricycle, which he has just bought, £80. That was money then. So that's 120 years ago, almost exactly. We move on to Charles, the fourth son, another musical son. Well, we assume he's musical. We don't know he was playing elsewhere. Was it a studio prop? Or was he in fact learning to play the violin? And a picture there on the right with him a bit older, actually at his brother's wedding. Oh no, this is the one at his brother's wedding. This was at James's wedding in 1920. Who took the photograph? Because James is in the photo, but probably one of the studio assistants. They did have assistants. They had mounters and colorists and all sorts of things. He also built a rather fine studio. In fact, probably the finest, one of the finest of the lot. And this is Speight's Corner in Kettering. And he built a house next door. This house you can just see on the left is another fantastic building. It's a wonderful house. I mean, this is grade 2 listed, I think it is. Studios upstairs. You can see the glass ceilings for the studios, and he had workrooms, changing rooms and all the rest, and a shop down below with pictures in the window. And just to see that more recently in colour, it really is a superb thing. Designed by John Alfred Gotch, well-known architect, was born into a Kettering Shoof family, well, and banking family, and he set up a private architectural practice. We have all the documents, the planning applications, the mortgage applications, and all the similar things still in the family, in part of Charles's grandson's family. He won a medal, did Charles, at the Hereford Photographic Exhibition. Won by Charles at the at Hereford. It's the Class B, that's not inferior. The Class A would have been open, but he got the first class medal in the open class. Lovely sterling silver medal. It's just behind me in my collection of Speight things. We found it on eBay. Wonderful what you can find. It will go down to the record office in due course. And so he put medalist then on all his pictures. So we can date these mounts as being post 1899 when he got the medal. Move on to Harry. Harry Harrison. Harrison was a family name. Here's a youngster and a bit older. This is in the back garden of the Speight studio in Rugby. It was quite large. And of course, it had the studio in it as well. Harrison set up in Warwick Street in Leamington for a while, back in 1898. And then he moved on to Redditch soon after. Not quite sure why. He didn't make a success of it, and he didn't stay there very long either. I don't think he was anything of a businessman, but he took quite good photographs. This is of the uncle or grandfather of a Rugby resident, and I happened to go down and see him, and he had quite a few Speight photographs, and this one by Harrison Speight. I think it's the only one I know of. No, it isn't. Wait a minute. There's also an only known cabinet print. We recognize the backcloth here as being one of his father's old ones. So we can look at the sort of date it was and think, wait a minute, his father was using that before then. He moved back to Rugby and sort of helped out at home. By this time, we'd lost the front garden. I think planning had sort of come in. They wanted to make room for a bus stop and make a wider pavement because this is just coming into town. So there are a few changes to the house. We've got a bay window, which we've seen planning for. And the interesting thing for this particular photo is this little square, oblong, should I say, on the door at the side. They were going to be accessing the studio at the back via the door at the side. And that plate is the Speight photographer brass plate. And that we found in again, a grandchild or even more of Harry Harrison. So back to that 1881 census, we've got all these boys, 6 sons and a daughter. But we've got pictures of another daughter, Eleanor Louisa. And here she is with James. This is James, so that's why we've got it in here. She's a bit older, and this is at big sister's wedding. So this was before big sister went to Sutton Coldfield. And again, we've got some lovely backdrops. But where was she in the census? Well, she was up here. She was at Cark Hall near Cartmel in Lancashire, home of Edward Hall Speight's sister, Elizabeth, and her husband, James Harrison, and also Eleanor Louisa Speight. They went up for a holiday when Eleanor was probably only 1 or 2, and realized that Elizabeth and James hadn't had any children. So Edward Hall Speight gave Eleanor to them, and she was brought up by them up in this vast house up in Lancashire. I think the shock was a bit much. She was always said she was very happy. She didn't speak until she was 5 years old, but as she says, after that, I never stopped. And she came down to Rugby for various family events. I mean, that is after she had gone up to Lancashire. So she came back down for the family wedding. She came down for other events. So we're now on to James, down at the bottom of the census. He was 2 in 1881. And these are the pictures that sort of show him through his life. We won't see all of his life today because we'll run out of time. Anyway, here's James, and again, a coloured version of the same picture done in a different, printed in an oval, just to show you how different things can be. These don't have mounts because these were copied from the family album, where they just stuck in the actual thin bit of photographic paper into the album rather than putting it onto a mount. In 1900, the studio assistant, Lottie Eyre, who you see in the picture, wrote in James's autograph book. And again, we've got his autograph book with all sorts of things. It's 13 years since I first knew the owner of this autograph book. He was then a little chap, 7 years old, who wore a tiny, tight-fitting jersey, so we called him Sausage. Not many people would know that. So we're going to see a few pictures of James with his family as he grows up. 1882, here he is in the front. Here's big sister. James and Claire Speight in the garden, virtually the same viewpoint that we saw Harry Harrison in a little while ago. Here he is 1885, about 6 years old. Short hair was obviously a thing in those days. This is taken again in a studio setting, but in the garden. You've got more light than inside, and you could get more people into the picture. And it's a sort of rustic scenes. Rustic was in on that occasion. James in 1886 and 1887. You must admit he is a confident child. There's no worry here that he's shy, not looking around. He's looking at the camera, he's still, and there's some very good photos. I mean, this one in particular is a superb photograph. And of course, he was practicing taking photographs even then. And here's James with one of the cameras on a great big tripod, taking a photograph, we assume, of his father. Or is he set up to be looking like taking a photograph while obviously somebody else takes a photograph? But an interesting pose. So James learned his trade by working with his father, and then gained experience by working elsewhere, kept a diary, 10 exercise books, ordinary school exercise books, which he kept fairly well for 1897 to 1900, half of which dealt with his time in King's Lynn, which are fascinating. And a researcher dealing with photography in King's Lynn has borrowed a lot of that information in order to highlight how photography was in King's Lynn at that time. Start of volume 1, he wrote, this was begun on my first leaving home for H.M. Whitlock's High Street, West Bromwich, on the 22nd of March, 1897. And the final two deal with the highlights, 1901 to 1914. He was getting busy by then. By the time he was 18, he was a committed Christian. Although his father was a Methodist, James was a sort of high Anglican in the Oxford movement. In West Bromwich, he'd often go to 3 church services. So his diary on the 4th of April, 1897 said he received the Blessed Sacrament at the parish church, met Clare, that's his older brother, at New Street Station, attended High Mass at St Albans, took Clare over to West Bromwich, returned to New Street and saw him off. In the evening, heard the Bishop of Coventry at St Philip's. And he later became a teacher in the Sunday school at Christ Church School. So he was busy being a Christian on Sundays. And the other thing here is you could get a train. Clare could come from Nuneaton down to New Street Station and down to visit. A few more little bits from James's diary. Christmas 1897, returned home at 7 o'clock. Christmas Day, Blessed Sacrament, Holy Trinity. Played golf in the Union Field. And halfpenny nap at night. That's a card game, not a sort of short sleep. Boxing Day, he went skating. And on the bank holiday, they took a train to Ullersthorpe and golfed at Broughton Ashby. Nap in the evening, again, card game. Easter Monday, party of us took a train to Shilton and golfed it to Binley. They'd just go along the road effectively, or along the side of the road. They were fairly not too busy, and they just sort of golfed along, then had dinner, walked to Brandon, more cards at night. So they've had an active life, these lads. They also had great fun taking photographs of each other and at home. They called them jape photographs. This is one I particularly like. It's got the seaside rock in it here, which we saw earlier. It's got the lighthouse backcloth and seaside. They put some sand on the studio floor and a bit of seaweed. Buckets and spades have come out, and they've been fishing for an old boot. And you get an idea of underclothing because James has rolled his trousers up for paddling and of course exposed his long john underpants. So, you know, this is Victorian England, what the well-dressed gent was wearing. These girls were studio assistants, or perhaps friends of them, but certainly they did get involved. We saw Lottie earlier when she talked about James the sausage. I think one of those is Lottie. I think probably this one. Anyhow, James next worked for Walter Davey in Harrogate, but Walter Davey decided he hadn't got enough experience in lighting and posing, so he was only there a month or so. But in 1898, in July, he was engaged by Mr. Wright of King's Lynn. And another of these farewell Jape photographs, James ready to depart with his bag and possessions, and the tearful studio assistants crying on his shoulder. And we know that's departure for King's Lynn because he wrote it on it. A lovely thing to have. Said goodbye to Gain, arrived at Lynn at 1:30. Amazing how you just get on a train. You know, can you go from Rugby to King's Lynn today? Probably not, not easily. Called at Mr. Wright's, who was out, was introduced to Mrs. Wright, got diggings with Mrs. Pratt, called again at Mr. Wright's, he being in this time. Wonderful bits from the diary. That Christmas, he was home for Christmas. And if you read that, you'll find they're all getting home by all sorts of different trains. 3:30, the midnight, Lizzie arrived on the Friday. Gull, that's Gulliver, from Market Harbour at 10 o'clock. Charlie from Kettering at 11 o'clock. We listened to the bells and then went to the station to meet Henry and James, who arrived at 1:30. God, I wouldn't have think of finding somebody at 1:30 in the morning nowadays. And again, Christmas Day, received the Blessed Sacrament, went on a short walk to see how the new Great Central Railway was progressing. Didn't last all that long, but it's just up the road from where I am now. I could walk there in about 5 minutes. At dinner and tea, I ate too much, evensong. It was a quiet Xmas Day, but you see, it was a Sunday, which would imply Christmas is quite noisy when it's a weekday, but quieter when it's a Sunday. In between times, he would help his brothers when they went on holiday. We saw the card from Claire in that time. This was probably about that time. James would be helping run their studio for them. I think as the youngest brother, it was sort of, well, come away from that job you're doing at the moment, come and help run my studio. So he took leave from King's Lynn and managed the studio in Nuneaton when Claire was on holiday. And he also started looking for other locations for himself. He looked at Coventry, Tamworth, Kidderminster and Wellingborough. It's all in the diary. But again, a nice Claire Speight mount, although probably taken by one of his assistants of James here, the man about town. Silk hat, long coat, brolly, high collar. Well, he didn't find a suitable location. He took a post with Varney of Lichfield. Then Charles became ill, so he left to look after the studio in Kettering. To gain more experience, he decided to work in Paris. He went there in September. Second class ticket, 25 and 7pence. Nice crossing. And he worked for a German photographer in Paris called Reutlinger. And he was being a retoucher. So he would make the ladies' waists look slimmer, and he would cut down the cheekbones so they were more elegant. But it was the year of the Great Exhibition. So he visited the Eiffel Tower, which was right on the site, went to the top, 1,000 feet, viewed. I decided the French smells strong. Skimmed through a few of the halls of the exhibition, didn't look carefully at anything, but simply tried to get an impression of the place. Well, of course, the Eiffel Tower had only been built about 18 months at that time, so it's really quite a thing to have to go over and see it. And here in this postcard, you can see some of the exhibition buildings below it. He bought quite a lot of postcards. This is the Palace of Electricity and the Castle of Water. He visited the Arc de Triomphe. You give the man what you like. The view is very fine. You see a grand arrangements of streets leading from the Arc. Well, he bought a French tie. He invested a lot of postcards. As I cannot afford photos coming from him, but obviously you know, that was the way to do it, the souvenir postcards. And there's quite a number of these in the album. I've got copies of them all, but they're now in the archive. But after a month, he got an offer from Varney in Lichfield, who he'd been working for earlier, £2 a week. So he gave his notice. It's a good salary. I'm only 21. I'm quite satisfied at the thought of returning. I've seen Paris, what I came for, and I've seen Reutlinger's way of work. So on the 6th of October, he left, boat train. Do not care for the look of Dieppe. He wasn't very French inspired, was he? Our boat was French, not so nice as the English one I came over in. It was crowded as usual. It was a rough crossing. A miserable 4 hours came to an end. I had vomited once. I had vomited 30 times. I could only manage a cup of tea at the station. The railway carriage was paradise. Home once more, found mum and dad as well as ever. Sorry, mother and dad. He wouldn't have said mum, would he? When he looked for possible other locations for a studio, visited and ruled out St Albans, Banbury, where he had this photo taken. We've got 2 copies of it. One is written on it, note the height of the collar and backward tilt of the head. And then he went to Stafford, Toxteth, Burton-on-Trent, Leicester, Coalville, Wellington, Shrewsbury. However, in the meanwhile, his brother-in-law had bought a house at 1 Ennerdale Road, Sutton Coldfield. And he'd also moved from Birmingham, well, that's why he bought a house, and bought a shop at 90 The Parade, Sutton Coldfield. We've got a rather nice picture of Walker's shop. He was really a dispensing chemist, but also did the photography bit. And to remember, he was married to the eldest sister. So James looked at possible locations to set up a studio in Sutton Coldfield. Decided on a premises in Victoria Road, left home for good on the 25th of February 1902. I suspect he was a bit encouraged by his sister and brother-in-law. You know, they were there. He got on very well with his sister and brother-in-law. Big sister, they really did hit it off. My studio is last dispatched from Newark in February. Studio arrived at Sutton. This was a sort of prefab studio, which the builders had to put some brickwork and put it up. Took 3 weeks to put it up, but they had worries with this surveyors. They had to move the foundations 4 times, which strikes me as not most competent builder, but there we are. The steps are finished. I have linoleum down and furniture in. And in fact, his first sitter was Mr. Bird. He'd promised him if he got it done, probably in good time, and a bit less than 3 weeks, he would take his photograph. Well, we're now in 1902. I'm going to play you some recordings as we're just about at the end. These were recorded at a Rotary Club luncheon in Sutton Coldfield in the 1960s. And I've got 4 short pieces about a minute or so each, and hopefully you'll be able to hear them.
Peace with the Boers, after 3 years of war, came at 10 o'clock in the evening on June the 1st, and the bells were ringing a merry peal. We decided to have a bonfire. We made it a bean sticks that was stuck outside round the shop for sale. Next morning, 4pence halfpenny a bundle. Round that shop, it was Fordra's in those days. It's now a jeweller's at the top of New Hall Street. It was a damn good bonfire. We held it slap bang in the middle of the roadway of the parade, opposite the Western Church, now the public library. Of course, on the part of the individual, this snobbery was unpleasant beyond words and also farcical. No lady would carry a parcel home on any consideration whatsoever. Carriage folk, when shopping, did not get out of their carriages. Indeed, no. The shopkeeper came out to them. And shopkeepers were not known away from their businesses. Indeed, no, it was not done by the best people. Oh, no, certainly not. Oh, dear, dear. In those days, ladies wore a horrible skirt. Oh, Lord. It had a long train to it. Oh. And this train, if not held up like this, dragged on the footpath amongst all the muck and dirt. Oh. Mind you, men were just, I suppose just as foolish really, but men were more foolish in the upper story of the human frame. Here's a photograph, his friend, of a very smart young man of those days. I was wearing a 3-inch... There were no ash bins, but there were ash pits. These were emptied every 6 months at either the landlord's or the tenant's expense. There were no public lavatories. The men, of course, were provided for at the pubs, but the ladies, I'm sorry to tell you, had to go to the railway station. There was no public library, but 2 shops on the parade that provided novels, 2d a week. Oh my God, they were. We never could find out where they got the things from. The only thing is that possibly now they're rather valuable as kind of representative of the trashy literature of the mid-Victorian period. Oh, it was dreadful. Oh, they were really awful. There was no hospital. Now, I'm not elaborating that because I just wasn't capable of doing so. Put that in your pipes and smoke it anyway. No hospital. No cinema. Come with me to the parade. Very early. About 6 o'clock. And men are hurrying to the station. They're catching the 6:15. They are the workmen, the manual labourers. They wear cloth caps. And in an hour's time, come to the parade again, and men hurrying to the station again. They are catching the 7:30. They are the clerks, the office workers, and the shop assistants. They wear bowler hats. Come once more to the parade with me. Ha ha, ha ha, that voice. Oh, about 9:15. Here they come. Oh, the top-notchers, the bosses, the stockbrokers, the managers, the lawyers, and the bank managers. Oh, my God. Here they all come. There's a smell of cigars. They do not hurry. No. They are going by the 9:30 non-stop. They wear black silk top hats. And as they cross Park Road and turn into Station Street, and the breeze flutters their frock coats, we will say goodbye.
Well, as you can see or hear,
We'll say goodbye.
things were very different in those days. Here's the parade where they were all walking down to the station, apparently, and this is one of James Speight's photos of Sutton Coldfield. We've gone on a little bit long, but there's an awful lot of material. It first went into a research report. That was 167 pages in 2009, was generously supported by Dick Speight, James Speight's son. The expanded version now has another 100 pages and is still growing, but if you want more details, it's not going to be reprinted in hard copy. However, there is a booklet which, if you like, summarizes the Speight family and has got 2 or 3 pages on James. But anyhow, there'll be far more next week on Sutton Coldfield and James's own photography, his time during the war when he was in the army, and we have a lot of photos of that, and his sort of later life and a bit of his retirement. As I said, I knew his son, his second son, and who was a wonderful chap. And I suspect James was very similar. Anyhow, that is all I have now. If there's any questions, you've probably been writing them down. I haven't seen them, but we can deal with any if we've got any time left from our allowance, because I've
well, thank you, John. I can hear everybody giving you a round of applause and nodding and saying to their the friends they sat next to how enjoyable and interesting that talk was, and how I think you set very well the scenes, the sort of family background that James came from, and then with those funny photos and the brilliant snippets of that talk he gave to the Rotary Club, really giving a good flavour of what James must have been like. So I can't wait for next week to see some of his work that he actually did here in Sutton.